Gentlemen, welcome back. Episode 7, or as my Spanish lesson taught me today, siete. Yeah, they really emphasize siete. I'm like, okay. Today's episode, man by the name that we know fondly as Old Hickory. You may have seen him on the $20 bill. His name is President Andrew Jackson. And we were asked to just discuss our opinion of this president. So I think we just talked about we're going to historically focus on his accomplishments and legacy that he left behind.
So he's the 7th president, and we were just kind of discussing he's the first president who's not a founding father. I guess probably fair to say he's not one of our favorites, but just to kind of put it in perspective, he's the first president. He's the 7th president. He's the first one who's not a founding father or the child of a founding father, like John Quincy Adams, his predecessor. And he's the first president from west of the Appalachian Mountains, which kind of earns him this moniker of being a hillbilly, even though he was a lawyer and fairly rich.
Yeah. He'll get a lot of credit to try and be like the common man. He's not the common man.
But part of that was that he was raised without kind of formal education. A lot of it, he was kind of born in the, you even look up like where he was born, it just gives you an area. Like it doesn't even, there's not even like really a town.
Right.
But like by the end of the revolution, he's essentially orphaned. His dad dies before he's born. And then he has, I think his one brother who dies of heat exhaustion in a battle. And then like his mom and other brother die of like a sickness. And so like he grows up like hating Great Britain. And then rises to prominence. One of the things that he's famous for is being, fighting Native Americans early on in his military, which turns into a political career, fighting the Creeks in Alabama, and then going on into Florida to fight the Seminoles. And then obviously that comes to fruition during his presidency when he puts in motion the Indian Removal Act.
And so Indian Removal Act, I want to say it's 1837. Basically says that Native Americans can be removed from their territory and, put in on reservations. And one of the biggest things here is that this piece of legislation, right, as we would think today, violates countless laws and amendments protecting people. But again, Native Americans aren't seen as citizens of the United States. Therefore, second-class citizens. This is my big bone to pick with Andrew Jackson. Like, this is my reason why I do not like him. The United States government is supposed to remove him from the $20 bill and put on Harriet Tubman, which would be pretty cool. And I'm very much in favor for. So there is a famous case that comes down through the. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and basically it is the Cherokee people of Georgia are going to sue for their rights, basically to have jurisdiction over their land, saying that they do not belong to the United States and therefore are not subject to anything like that. And it goes through the pipeline, like starting in Florida, and goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, in which famous Justice first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, if I believe, John Marshall, hands down a decision ruling in favor of the Cherokee, saying that they had autonomy and their rights were only to be negotiated through the federal government. And the quote comes pretty famously from Jackson, saying John Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see it in him enforce it. And one of the things that is Andrew Jackson doesn't actually have anything to enforce, nor does John Marshall in this original act, but it does end up leading to the removal of the Cherokee people from Georgia. And one of the biggest things is you have thousands of people die along this trail that we know today is the Trail of Tears. And we have tons of accounts of not only the Native Americans, but also of the soldiers that were forced to guard them as they made their way, as you can see behind Barker, to Oklahoma, or what was the Indian Territory. And in my opinion, you're the President of the United States. You have a right to do what is necessary, whatever Congress deems necessary, or another check and balance is whatever the Supreme Court deems is necessary. And Jackson did not do that. And so in my opinion, no matter what he did that was good during his presidency, this alone treatment of this whole group of people is makes him a negative figure in history for me.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's things that Jackson does that are historical first, but I don't think it outweighs what he did with the Trail of Tears. Like, he's the first presidential candidate who actually like campaigns. Like, he's viewed as the common man, like we've talked about before. And like in 1824, he loses the election to John Quincy Adams. He actually has more electoral votes after the electors vote than Adams does, but does not have the majority. So it goes to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay essentially throws his support behind John Quincy Adams and throws his 37 votes there instead of with Jackson. And so Jackson loses, and he kind of throws out this idea that it's kind of where the first iteration of like drain the swamp. Like, this was a backroom deal, and that, we need to get rid of the people who've almost like the rabbling you hear today about term limits and all of that kind of starts back then. But I mean, he's not, I don't know. There's people talk about Jacksonian democracy, this idea that the common man has a place in American government. And that was the first election where in 1828 was the first election where non-landowning whites got to vote in some states. And it was also because we just added 5 more Western states or 6 more Western states. So a lot of them identified with him a lot more than they did with the landed elite from back east. He's referred to by his enemies as the king because, he did what he wanted. Like, he instead of the president kind of being somebody who kind of hangs back and makes decisions when they need to, and a lot of it's done by Congress, he really started like putting his influence on things. And one of the problems with him not having a long political record or history was that people didn't know how he stood, what his opinion was on a lot of items. So you're bringing in an unknown person to take over 1/3 of the government. And then he essentially, there's the nullification crisis where South Carolina is going to say that they're going to essentially nullify or veto, put in place a tariff that the U.S. government has approved. And while, yes, he resolves the crisis by threatening to like invade with the army. Yep. And he, on the down low, like starts replacing the military units in South Carolina with ones that are allied to him, not to the country, but like to him as a general.
Right.
So, he got things done, but the way he did it wasn't necessarily the right way, but it does lead to more autonomy for the presidency later.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think you can give him those down the line victories.
Yeah.
I think where a lot of this comes is that he starts off as this great kind of Americana, like almost like an American folktale. He was born in the woods. He became a general, raised himself up by his boots, pulled himself up by his bootstraps.
Yeah.
But then like when we start looking back with a more historical lens and we're like, the way he treated Native Americans was terrible. And then some people say, well, he didn't actually remove them. That was Van Buren who did that after him. But he's the one that set the ground, set the groundwork in place for that so that Van Buren just had to come in and say, yeah, let's do it.
And Jackson's one of the first ones, as we also can talk about, is the first one to implement what we now know today is the spoil system, which is where you put your buddies in the seats of power. And we see this now from every single president. Usually a president, when they're elected, if they're a new one, they clean house of the cabinet and bring in their own group to kind of – basically you're rewarding people who supported you. And Jackson's the first one to kind of do this, which again encourages that backwoods movement that, hey, I am draining the swamp, even though he never used those terms. And so he just has this persona about himself. Yes, he did great things that did help the country. Nullification crisis, again, like Barker said, was a huge one, preventing a state from leaving, but doing it, through force. And then the unique thing is, like I said, my biggest complaint is him not respecting another branch. But then you look, he himself probably would have opposed the tariff. It was called the Tariff of Abominations. Even it was Tariff 1828, and he still supports the fact that Congress made this decision. Again, Congress made the decision originally with the Indian Removal Act, so not making the best decisions as it is. But again, he has a kind of he's a hero of the Battle of New Orleans. I think it's Woody Guthrie, right, that sings that song.
Yeah.
New Orleans, yeah. So it's a Battle of New Orleans.
The greatest victory we have in the War of 1812, which takes place after the war is over.
2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent is signed. So, but yeah. So, anything else to add on Old Hickory here?
Well, I mean, people kind of say, well, he was the first one to say that, well, anybody could be president, but it really kind of brings up the kind of the old adage of just because you can doesn't mean that maybe you shouldn't. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
So, like, looking at it, it's just one of these things where, like, going back to our last video about the Electoral College, like, why don't we let the common man vote? Because the common man at times isn't the best person to lead the country. Just because you say what people like doesn't mean it's the best thing for the country. And that's kind of what republicanism is all about. It's about having the people who, kind of have the better knowledge to make things. There's a lot of parallels in my mind between him and President Trump. Not saying that President Trump's a bad president, but just the fact that he's an outsider, he's not from politics. It's that new voice that people wanted to hear. So I think that was kind of a really interesting angle that kind of came up in my brain as I was talking about him and reading about him.
Yeah, and the other thing here too, like Barker said, was that even if you can do something, maybe you shouldn't or anything like that. And people saying kind of what they want to say, just be aware that this kind of applies to today, right? Anyone's an expert now on the internet. And, people might say the same thing about us, that we don't know what we're talking about or whatever. Again, these videos are more for enjoyment and just kind of spitballing our stuff. But people will say whatever they want. Always go and check. I mean, even check us. We don't mind. Put it in the comments, We can acknowledge when we're wrong. So, again, just kind of keeping that in mind. We're ready for next week's topic?
I believe we've decided that we are going to talk about the history of chocolate, which was submitted by a student. So shout out to Miss Shields.
Shields, for those of you who don't know that inside joke.
For being the first student submitted topic that we're going to talk. Well, second. Sorry, World War II. The World War II topic
was World War II was hers as well. So
I apologize.
Yeah, you're all good.
Recognizing when we're wrong.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk about chocolate just kind of in general, where it comes from, where we see it in history pop up first. And then we're going to go into kind of the history of like our favorite candy companies. So you'll have to stay tuned and find out which chocolates you want to buy Turn and Bark. So until then, I'm Turn.
I'm Bark.
And we didn't do this at the beginning, and it bothers me now. But we're going to be here a long time.
Yeah, at least 2 more weeks.
Yep. Have a good night.
Be safe.
And be well. Good night, everybody.